The silence of Jack Sterling was not a choice made of peace, but a fortress built of necessity, a wall of calcified trauma designed to keep the ghosts of the Obsidian Unit from spilling into the modern world. For 40 years, he had lived in a small cabin on the edge of the Oregon coast, the salt spray of the Pacific acting as a constant abrasive against the memories that threatened to drown him. He was a man of iron and shadow, a veteran whose name was whispered in the corridors of power, with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. People often asked why he never wrote a memoir, why he never stood at a podium to receive the medals that gathered dust in a locked footlocker beneath his bed. But Jack knew that to speak of the Obsidian Unit was to invite the darkness back into his lungs. The error, the fatal catastrophic miscalculation, was not just a tactical blunder. It was a rupture in the very fabric of human morality. It began in the humid, suffocating jungles of the Kaelo Basin, a region so remote it didn't appear on civilian maps, where the air was thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and the metallic tang of blood. The Obsidian Unit was an elite strike force, a collection of men who had been stripped of their identities and rebuilt as instruments of kinetic energy. They were the scalpel in the dark, the hand that did what the politicians refused to acknowledge. On the night of the incident, the sky was a bruised purple, choked by the smoke of distant phosphorus strikes. Jack remembered the way his boots sank into the mud, a rhythmic squelch that sounded like a heartbeat. Command had given them a simple objective: neutralize a high-value target hidden within a fortified village. But the intelligence was worse than flawed. It was manufactured. As they moved through the tree line, the thermal scopes on their rifles painted the world in ghostly shades of white and gray. Colonel Vance, a man whose soul had been replaced by a series of operational protocols, signaled the advance. The Obsidian Unit moved like a single organism, a lethal shadow crossing the threshold of the perimeter. Jack felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, that cold electric buzz that sharpened his vision until he could see the individual veins on the leaves. Then, the first shot rang out, not from the enemy, but from the center of their own formation. It was a nervous twitch, a momentary lapse in discipline by a rookie named Billy Miller, but in the hypertension of the Kaelo Basin, it was the spark that leveled the forest. The village wasn't a military outpost. It was a refugee collection point, filled with the very people the Obsidian Unit was theoretically supposed to protect. But once the first grenade was tossed, the logic of the mission collapsed into the logic of the kill. Jack watched through his sights as a woman stepped out of a hut, her hands raised, her mouth open in a silent plea. Before his brain could process her humanity, a burst of high-velocity rounds from Vance's carbine tore through her chest, the impact flipping her backward like a ragdoll. The sound was unforgettable, a wet, slapping noise followed by the clatter of her skull against the dry earth. The error had begun. In the chaos, the unit fell into a feedback loop of aggression. They saw movement and they fired. They heard a sound and they threw steel. Jack found himself swept up in the momentum, his fingers working the trigger with a mechanical indifference that would later haunt his every waking hour. He saw a young man, no older than 16, trying to drag a child toward a drainage ditch. Jack's bullet caught him in the neck, spray painting the child's face in a vibrant, sickening crimson. The boy slumped, his life leaking into the dirt in rapid, rhythmic pulses, while the child sat frozen, staring at the empty air where a brother had just been. The air in the village became a soup of cordite and copper. The Obsidian Unit moved house to house, clearing rooms with a terrifying efficiency that left no room for discernment. Doors were kicked in, flashbangs blinded the innocent, and then the lead followed. Jack remembered entering a small infirmary. The smell of antiseptic was quickly overwhelmed by the stench of scorched flesh. A doctor, still wearing a blood-stained apron, tried to shield a row of cots. He was met with a bayonet thrust that pinned him to the wooden wall, his legs kicking frantically until the light faded from his eyes. There was no glory here, only the systematic erasure of life. The fatal error was the realization that the target they were sent to kill had never been there. The entire operation was a diversion, a way to clear a path for a corporate pipeline by eliminating the local population under the guise of counterinsurgency. When the realization finally dawned on the men, when the screams died down and the only sound left was the crackling of burning thatch, the silence was heavier than the gunfire. Vance stood in the center of the square, his face splattered with the gore of a dozen strangers, and simply checked his watch. He didn't look at the bodies. He didn't look at the ruin. He looked at the time. In the decades that followed, the weight of the Kaelo Basin became a physical presence in Jack Sterling's life, a phantom limb that throbbed with the memory of cold steel and hot blood. He moved from the Oregon coast to a secluded ranch in Montana, seeking a horizon that wasn't blocked by the ghosts of the jungle. But the ghosts followed. They were in the way the wind whistled through the pines, sounding like the dying gasps of the doctor in the infirmary. They were in the red sunsets that reminded him of the phosphorus rounds blooming over the canopy. He had tried to bury the truth under a mountain of mundane tasks, chopping wood until his hands bled, fixing fences that didn't need fixing. But the Obsidian Unit was a stain that wouldn't wash out. He lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, his ears attuned to the sound of tires on gravel, expecting the arrival of men in dark suits who would finally come to finish what was started in the jungle. He knew that Vance had gone on to become a consultant for private defense contractors, his hands still clean in the eyes of the public, his pockets lined with the blood money of the pipeline. The injustice of it was a slow poison in Jack's veins. He had seen Billy Miller's mother at a funeral years later, her eyes hollow with a grief she couldn't name because the government had told her Billy died in a training accident. Jack had stood 10 feet away from her, the truth burning in his throat like acid. But he said nothing. To speak was to break the seal on a tomb that contained more than just his own reputation. It contained the foundation of a dozen political careers and the stability of a multi-billion-dollar energy sector. The deeper error, the one that truly kept him silent, was the realization that the Obsidian Unit hadn't been tricked. They had been chosen because the brass knew they wouldn't stop once the killing started. They were selected for their capacity to become monsters. Jack looked at his own hands, weathered and scarred, and saw the hands of a creature that shouldn't exist in a civilized world. He remembered a specific moment during the sweep after the infirmary, when he encountered a girl hiding beneath a pile of laundry. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering orange light of the fires. For a split second, the machine in Jack's mind stalled. The soldier wanted to move on, but the human, the small flickering ember of Jack Sterling, stared back. Then Sergeant Frank Rollins, a man who relished the cleansing aspect of their work, pushed past him. Rollins didn't hesitate. He emptied a magazine into the pile of clothes, the fabric jumping and twitching as the rounds shredded both the cotton and the child beneath. Rollins had laughed, a dry, hacking sound, and slapped Jack on the shoulder, telling him to keep his head in the game. That laughter was the sound Jack heard every time he tried to pray. It was the sound of a morality that had been completely inverted. As the years turned into a lifetime, the internal pressure began to crack the facade. Jack started receiving letters, unsigned, postmarked from Washington, D.C., containing nothing but coordinates, the coordinates for Kaelo. Someone else was still alive, someone who wanted him to remember, or perhaps someone who wanted to see if he would finally break. He suspected it was Rollins, or what was left of him, playing one last psychological game. The fatal error wasn't just the civilian casualties. It was the fact that the Obsidian Unit had been allowed to return home at all. They were a contagion, a group of men who had seen the void and brought a piece of it back with them. Jack's silence was his only way of quarantining the infection. He stayed away from people, avoided mirrors, and lived a life of deliberate obscurity. But the hunger for the truth is a relentless thing. A young journalist named Sarah Jenkins had recently begun digging into the records of the Kaelo Basin, finding the discrepancies Jack had spent 40 years trying to ignore. She had found his name in a redacted file, a ghost in the machine. When she finally tracked him down to his ranch, standing there with a notebook and a look of desperate hope, Jack felt the wall finally begin to crumble. He looked at her, seeing the same innocence he had seen in the girl under the laundry pile, and he knew that if he told her the truth, he would be destroying her world just as surely as if he had pulled the trigger. The veteran's silence was a mercy. It was the final wall between a world that believed in heroes and a reality where men like the Obsidian Unit were the ones holding the line. He turned away from her, retreating into the shadows of his porch, the secret of the fatal error locked behind his teeth, a heavy, jagged stone that he would carry into the earth, ensuring that the darkness of the Kaelo Basin died with him. The persistence of Sarah Jenkins was a slow-acting poison, a relentless dripping of water against the stone of Jack's resolve that threatened to wash away the decades of quiet he had so carefully cultivated. She didn't leave when he turned his back. She stayed in the small town at the base of the mountains, checking into a derelict motel and appearing at the end of his driveway every morning like a recurring fever dream. Jack watched her through binoculars from his darkened living room, observing the way she clutched a manila folder to her chest as if it were a shield. Inside that folder lay the fragmented geometry of the Kaelo Basin disaster, satellite imagery that showed the village before and after the thermal event, redacted manifestos of the chemical payloads the Obsidian Unit had carried, and the most damning evidence of all, a recorded radio transmission that had somehow escaped the shredders at Langley. Jack knew what was on that tape. He didn't need to hear it to know it was the sound of Colonel Vance ordering the sanitization of the area, his voice as calm as a man ordering a cup of coffee while women and children were being turned into carbon and ash in the background. The error was compounding. Every day Jack remained silent. The lie grew larger, feeding on the ignorance of the public and the complicity of the survivors. One evening, the Montana sky turned a violent, bruised orange, and the wind began to howl through the gaps in the cabin's timber, a sound so much like a human scream that Jack found himself reaching for the service pistol he kept taped to the underside of his kitchen table. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular beat that felt like Billy Miller's dying spasms. He couldn't take it anymore. He walked out onto the porch, the air biting at his skin, and beckoned Sarah toward the house. She approached with a mixture of triumph and terror, recognizing the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had already died once and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. He didn't offer her a chair or a glass of water. He sat her down at the wooden table and spread the contents of her folder across the scarred surface, his hands trembling with a rage that had been bottled for 40 years. He told her about the error of proximity, a term the military used to sanitize the fact that they had deployed white phosphorus in a zone known to be populated by non-combatants. He described the way the air itself seemed to catch fire, the phosphorus particles sticking to skin and burning through muscle and bone, impossible to extinguish. He told her about Frank Rollins, who had walked through the smoke with a thermal optic, picking off the survivors who crawled toward the river, their bodies glowing like white-hot coals in the infrared spectrum. Jack's voice was a dry rasp, the sound of gears grinding without oil. He told her how the fatal error wasn't a mistake of coordinates, but a deliberate test of the Obsidian Unit's psychological breaking point. High Command wanted to know if they could create a unit that would execute anyone, regardless of age or innocence, if the word insurgent was applied to the target. They weren't soldiers. They were a laboratory experiment in the eradication of the human conscience. As he spoke, the details became more graphic, the memories bleeding out of him like an open wound. He described the smell of the village after the fires died down, a cloying, sweet stench that stuck to their uniforms for weeks, a smell that no amount of industrial soap could remove. He talked about the way the earth looked the next morning, covered in a fine layer of gray ash that was all that remained of the infirmary, and the 40 souls inside it. Sarah was crying now, her pen hovering over her notebook, paralyzed by the weight of the testimony. She had come for a story of government corruption, but she had found a story of the death of the soul. Jack didn't stop. He told her about the aftermath, how they were flown out on a midnight transport, their gear incinerated, their names scrubbed from the mission logs. He told her about the suicide pact that wasn't a pact at all, but a series of accidents that claimed the lives of the other 6 members of the unit over the next decade. Billy Miller didn't shoot himself because of guilt. He was found in a garage with a hose connected to his exhaust pipe, the door locked from the outside. Jack realized then that his silence hadn't been an act of penance. It had been an act of survival. He was the last one left because he was the only one who had successfully disappeared. But by talking to Sarah, he had ended his invisibility. He looked at the girl and saw the death sentence he had just handed her. The information she now possessed was a high-voltage wire that would burn anyone who touched it. The Obsidian Unit's error was fatal because it never ended. It was a self-sustaining cycle of violence that required the permanent erasure of anyone who knew the truth. Just as he reached the end of the narrative, describing the way Colonel Vance had looked him in the eye and told him that history is written by the men who stay alive, a pair of headlights cut through the Montana darkness, sweeping across the cabin walls. 2 black SUVs were moving slowly up the gravel drive, their engines a low, predatory hum. Jack stood up, his face devoid of emotion, and handed Sarah his car keys. He told her there was a back trail through the woods that led to the highway, and she had exactly 3 minutes to move. The error was finally coming to its natural conclusion. He wasn't going to run this time. He was going to wait for them on the porch, the ghosts of the Kaelo Basin standing in ranks behind him, finally ready to witness the end of the last man who remembered their names. The headlights of the SUVs died simultaneously, leaving the ranch in a suffocating, artificial darkness. Jack pushed Sarah toward the back door, his grip on her shoulder firm and cold. He didn't give her a chance to argue or offer a tearful goodbye. In the world of the Obsidian Unit, sentiment was a secondary casualty. He watched her shadow disappear into the thicket of pines, her footsteps light and frantic. He knew she had the recorder, and he knew she had the drive. Now, he had to provide the diversion that would make those items matter. Jack stepped back into the kitchen and retrieved a heavy metal case from the floorboards. Inside was his old M4 carbine, a relic he had maintained with a religious, almost obsessive devotion. He checked the action, the metallic slide sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. He had 4 magazines, a handful of flash grenades he'd acquired through back-channel contacts years ago, and a heart that had finally stopped racing. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. He was no longer Jack Sterling, the hermit of Montana. He was once again a ghost of the Kaelo Basin. He stepped onto the porch just as the first man cleared the corner of the barn. The intruder was moving in a low-drag tactical stance, clad in matte black ceramic plating. Private security, likely Vanguard Solutions, the shell company Vance used to sanitize his wet work. Jack didn't wait for a challenge. He raised the carbine and fired a 3-round burst. The first 2 caught the man in the chest plate, staggering him. The third found the soft tissue beneath the jaw. The man went down without a sound, his body folding into the dirt as his rifle discharged a useless spray of lead into the porch railing. "Vance!" Jack roared, his voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "I know you're in the back seat of that second rig. Come out and finish the error yourself." The response was a hail of suppressed fire that shredded the wooden siding of the cabin. Jack rolled behind a stack of seasoned oak firewood, the splinters stinging his cheeks. He counted the shooters by the muzzle flashes. 4, maybe 5. They were professionals overlapping their fields of fire, moving in a pincer maneuver designed to flush him toward the open field. He reached into his vest, pulled the pin on a flashbang, and cooked it for 2 seconds before lobbing it toward the SUV. The world turned a blinding, screaming white. In the 3 seconds of disorientation that followed, Jack moved. He didn't retreat into the house. He charged. He caught the second shooter near the front bumper, driving a combat knife into the man's brachial artery before his eyes could readjust. Blood sprayed across the hood of the vehicle, hot and dark. Jack grabbed the man's dropped radio and heard a voice. Cold, clipped, and hauntingly familiar. "Sterling is mobile. Do not engage at range if you can help it. I want the drive before he dies." It was Vance. The colonel hadn't changed. To him, human life was still just a variable in an equation of assets and liabilities. Jack ducked behind the rear tire of the first SUV as a grenade detonated inside the cabin, blowing the front windows outward in a rain of glass. The fire started almost immediately, the old wood hungrily devouring the flames. Jack looked at his home, the only place where he'd found even a modicum of peace, and felt nothing but relief. Let it burn. Let the records and the metals and the blood-stained floorboards all go to ash. He worked his way around the flank, using the smoke from the burning cabin as cover. He found the third man near the well house. This one was faster. A bullet grazed Jack's shoulder, tearing through the muscle and sending a jolt of white-hot agony down his arm. Jack gritted his teeth, leveled his rifle one-handed, and emptied the rest of the magazine into the man's center mass. The shooter fell backward into the well, the splash echoing like a distant memory of the Kaelo drainage ditches. Jack dropped the empty mag and fumbled for another, but his left arm was failing. The blood loss was making the edges of his vision curl and darken. He slumped against the cold stone of the well house, gasping for air that tasted of cordite and pine. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder. A tall, silver-haired figure stepped into the light of the burning cabin. Colonel Vance didn't look like a monster. He looked like a grandfather on a hunting trip, wearing a high-end tactical jacket and holding a custom pistol with the practiced ease of a man who had killed hundreds. He looked down at Jack, his expression one of mild disappointment. "You were always the weak link, Jack," Vance said, his voice smooth and devoid of malice. "You had a conscience in a profession that doesn't permit one. You kept that silence for 40 years not out of guilt but out of fear. And now, you've put a young girl's life on the line for a truth that the world isn't even interested in hearing." Jack looked up, a bloody grin spreading across his face. The world doesn't need to be interested, Vance. It just needs to be infected. Sarah is already gone. The upload started the moment she hit the highway. Every major news outlet in the country has the Kaelo files now. You aren't cleaning up a mess anymore. You're just standing in the middle of it. Vance's eyes narrowed, the first flicker of genuine emotion, rage, crossing his features. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly between Jack's eyes. Then you'll go first. I went a long time ago, Jack whispered. In the jungle, I've just been waiting for my body to catch up. The gunshot was lost in the roar of the collapsing roof. As the cabin fell, sending a pillar of sparks into the Montana night, the fatal error of the Obsidian Unit was finally, irrevocably brought to light. Jack Sterling died in the dirt, but for the first time in 40 years, the ghosts were silent. The fire at the Sterling Ranch burned for 3 days, a beacon of cleansing heat that the local fire department couldn't contain. By the time the embers cooled into a gray, skeletal landscape, there was little left to identify the men who had died there. The state police found the remains of 2 SUVs and several bodies charred beyond recognition, but the federal government moved in within hours, cordoning off the mountain under the guise of an environmental hazard. However, the silence Jack Sterling had maintained for 40 years had already been shattered. Sarah Jenkins had reached a secure server in a small library 3 towns over before the first SUV had even cooled. The Kaelo files didn't just trickle onto the internet. They detonated. The recorded voice of Colonel Vance ordering the sanitization of the basin became the most played audio file in the world within 48 hours. The images, the thermal ghosts of children fleeing phosphorus blooms, were plastered across the front pages of every major international publication. The public, which Vance had claimed wouldn't care, reacted with a visceral global fury. The political fallout was a slow-motion landslide. Senators who had taken campaign contributions from the pipeline's parent company suddenly found their offices under federal investigation. Military archives were subpoenaed, and the name Obsidian Unit moved from a whispered myth to a household word for atrocity. Colonel Vance was never brought to a traditional trial. 6 weeks after the fire, he was found in his study in Virginia. He had been stripped of his consultant's fees, his assets were frozen, and his legacy was a stain that no amount of power could bleach. He didn't leave a note. He died by the same caliber of bullet that had ended Jack Sterling's life, though his death carried none of the veteran's hard-won peace. A year later, a small monument appeared in the Kaelo Basin. It wasn't built by a government or a corporation. It was a simple stone wall, paid for by a foundation Sarah Jenkins started with the proceeds of her book, The Fatal Error. The wall listed 42 names, the villagers who had been erased from history for the sake of a pipeline. At the very bottom of the wall, separated from the others by a small gap, was a final name, Jack Sterling. He wasn't listed as a hero, and he wasn't listed as a victim. He was simply listed as a witness, the man who had finally stopped running, ensuring that while the error was fatal, it would never again be a secret. The silence of the Obsidian Unit was over, and in its place the truth remained, cold, heavy, and eternal.